start off, Matthew, the team captain, he will be for to keep people safe. We need limits to free speech. Please carry on.
Can I move this, please?
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my young 18 years of life, I have been fed a number of sayings and adages. But I think the one that I have the most problem with is the saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me." Because I think that words do cut. They do hurt us. And on a societal level, when they're left unkept, unregulated, they fester into a shackle that constrains the most vulnerable in our society. They turn us into a society against ourselves. It's on that basis we're very proud to put in regulations to stop speech where it hurts. In terms of definitions, I'm going to clarify a couple key points. Firstly, just in terms of limits, what do we mean by that? I think it's very clear in terms of we understand that there are external forces that limit our certain rights and our actions within society. That looks like either the law, it looks like law enforcement, it looks like judges and courts and so forth. We're happy to stand by that. I think secondly, though, to the extent in which we limit free speech, it's relatively clear given the status quo right now, we do limit a lot of things that we find unreasonable. Stuff like the inability to yell fire in the middle of a crowded room, the ability to call the school and tell them that there was a bomb there for no good reason. We think that under that principle, we're fine to defend that. What we are willing to support furthermore, though, is the ability to instate further hate speech laws in terms of banning people from enticing violence. That looks like just people creating riots and creating unreasonable marches in cities. It looks like people spreading untrue facts and denying true events that do have an effect on people. That looks like, for instance, Holocaust deniers, where we're fine to call that hate speech. And thirdly, just the spreading of misinformation and disinformation in a kind of malicious intent. Because we believe that there is an intrinsic difference between making a reasoned and logical argument against, say, institutionalized religion, as opposed to making an emotional profession of why religion in and of itself is bad. We think that insofar as we're discriminating against people, we're fine to put enforcements on that. Secondly, then, I think I'm going to argue a couple main points here. Firstly, I'm going to argue why free speech needs to be regulated in order to protect people. Secondly, I'm going to argue why one of the main pushes that opposition is likely going to bring, that is the marketplace of ideas and the value of having discourse within society, actually generally isn't true. And finally, then, I'm going to leave my other speakers to respond to the arguments that opposition will inevitably bring. First point, then, on protection. I think the context under which this point lies is that rights don't exist in isolation. They are in competition with one another. That means is that we understand that freedom of expression is important for a person's autonomy. It is important because they are a person, and we want to give them rights to act in the way that they believe is true to themselves. However, we also acknowledge that there are other rights within a society that opposes that. For instance, the ability to keep people out of harm's way, the ability to do things for the better good. We think that insofar then as people are making threats and and causing direct and indirect harm via the words that they say, there is a moral obligation then for us to prevent it. I think though then we have to note really quickly before this gets just as a way of clarification that in a lot of ways, we don't restrict a lot of speech, right? In the same way that I can say that I like cats and maybe you prefer dogs, this isn't necessarily an assault on your dignity, this isn't an assault on your character. We think that it's only in the instances in which it's a very clear, obvious insinuation of malicious intent, of me attacking your character and insulting your dignity, that intervention needs to happen. I think that this is relatively clear, given that in the status quo, we don't have laws against stuff like hate speech. We don't criminally punish them. We think that insofar as they're able to outlaw that kind of thing and create law enforcement against it, that's a very good thing. Okay, on to the point itself. I think it's really important to note that unregulated speech and unregulated free speech is harmful in three distinct ways. Firstly, that it breeds discrimination. That means that insofar as you're able to say whatever you want, there is nothing stopping you from discriminating against your neighbor, from discriminating against a friend at school, from discriminating against an entire ethnic minority that you have a biased hatred towards. We think then that regardless of what you determine your own agency to be, that is a harm in and of itself, and we'll discuss the impacts on those people. But note here that discrimination is something very unique to unregulated free speech, because insofar as we have to say whatever we want, we can't control it. People get hurt. Secondly, then, I think the other unique damage of this is misinformation. That looks like, for instance, the ability for politicians, say in other very big countries that have blonde hair, to be able to spin facts in a way that is necessarily untrue and that directly forwards an agenda that is harmful towards a group of people. We think then that having that kind of speech, creating narratives against groups of people is harmful, that's morally culpable. Thirdly then, we think just in terms of lies, I think just in terms of making people, like inciting people towards violence on the basis of untrue facts is very, very bad. I think that that causes structural violence. I think that that's something that we ought to overcome. I think then the outcomes of this point are relatively clear. Firstly, unregulated free speech results in stuff like echo chambers. It results in a group of people being to continuously feed each other false facts, and that it ends up oftentimes resulting in things like hate crimes and the marginalization and segregation of entire populations. I think also it creates just a polarized culture. It creates a culture that tells us that insofar as I don't agree with you, I can use my words as violence. I can attack you in a way that the law currently does not have any issue with. I think note then that we think that freedom of expression is an important consideration, but it's something that isn't weighed as highly as the ability to protect our fellow citizens. I think that this point is important for three reasons. Firstly, on moral assault. That means that I would wager that this act of free speech is analogous to violence. That is to say that it is an assault on human dignity, it is what results in things like counter-movements, and it results in the actual physical harm of people on a philosophical level. But outside of that principal argument, I think that there are two structural ways in which this violence does accrue. Firstly, in terms of physical violence, in the sense that you go out to protest and you genuinely hurt someone. But secondly, in the more intangible way of us fearing violence, right? For us not wanting to speak out our opinions in fear of getting hurt, being hurt by other people that are willing to attack us. We think that that is a bad thing. We think that that's something that we're willing to oppose. But thirdly, just in terms of general fear. Because note that a lot of people in our status quo live already under systems of marginalization. People like gay people, for example, trans people of color. We think that insofar as they're unable to defend themselves, that means that we have a structural obligation to protect them. I'll explain that later. But thirdly, just on precedent, meaning that the law itself condones this ability for us to separate our society based on arbitrary ideological values. We think that that is a harm. We think that that is something that we should not necessarily condone. So I think that at the opposition's best case, and let's be charitable here, they maybe be able to prove that, freedom of speech is really good because we're able to debate it and we're able to come up with good ideas. I'm going to structurally disprove why that is false, but even if you do believe that point, I think that you have to consider all the tangible harms of free speech. That is to say that we have black people in America being beaten out in the streets. We have trans people being unable to speak about their own personal experiences out of fear of being harmed. I think that that is something that trumps any other consideration. Then, I think really quickly on this idea of a principal obligation for the state. And note that this is regardless of any practical consideration, because that is to say that regardless of any real violence that really meaningfully does occur in this debate, we say that insofar as some level of harm towards a person is happening, the state, the government has a responsibility to help them. Why is that the case? It's because oftentimes these marginalized groups don't have the capacity to help themselves. That means that they're oftentimes put into positions where they don't have any power to create institutional change. That looks like the state having to restrict their rights towards other things in return for, say, them being like a good law-abiding citizen. I think then that insofar as the state is able to help them, we should, because we have an obligation, because we restrict a number of their rights. I think that looks like three ways that we can help them. Firstly, in terms of deterrence, that is that we stop people from wanting to commit hate speech in the first place. Secondly, I think it's recompense. Under the circumstances in which hate speech does occur, we're able to, give them back a lot of like a monetary value that is significant enough to restore the dignity that was lost. We think that that's really good. I'm going to move on to the next point then, on why this idea of the marketplace of ideas doesn't necessarily stand. And I think it's really quickly, just for the audience, to define what the marketplace of ideas is. I think the argument here is that we should allow free speech because it allows ideas to be debated, and then insofar as we're able to identify bad arguments, we're able to denounce those, we're only left with good arguments, we're able to progress as a society like that. I think, though, that this claim is structurally untrue for four reasons. Firstly, because note here that in a lot of cases, the bad opinions never get shut out. That is to say that in a lot of these debates, dominant voices, people in positions of power, are the ones that are arguing. That means that they have the ability to stomp on the minority, to stomp on the minority views. That means that oftentimes bad arguments just fester to the top. Secondly, then, I think that even if you do shut them down, that these kind of bad ideas still exist. That means that even if we do denounce racism, racist groups still appear. The only way we can meaningfully stop that is by outlawing them in the first place. Thirdly then, or just noting that like this argument is premised on the idea of people having good disagreements. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy the characterization that people are good at arguing and that we can come up with like good like resolutions to disagreements. I think that oftentimes a compromise isn't made, that people are just left in the wake of hate and
30 seconds.
assaults. I think then that the way you should view this debate is that firstly, the opposition side can't get any benefit. Because the only thing they're meaningfully defending is a marginal benefit to bigots and for discriminatory people to be able to hold their rights to say the things they want. I think on our side, insofar as we get the ability to defend the minority voice, when we're able to win, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you. The response against is team captain Peter.
Okay, welcome today. Glad to see you all here. I'm going to be talking about how free speech is critical for a healthy democracy and a healthy science, and to be able to have a system where everyone is free to be able to express themselves and have self-expression. The Moot is essentially saying that we need to have some kind of safety rules in order to be able to control who can speak. There are already limits to what you can talk about. For example, there are suppression orders. You are already not allowed to threaten people with violence. So the discussion about violence that we've already heard, free speech does not permit violence or to permit that someone try and engage in violence or to try and recommend that occur. So there are already limits around that. There are also limits around libel, which is effectively lying, mainly for financial benefit, but so it's a little more limited than just saying untruths. So we've been talking, the affirmative would like you to believe that only bigots are the people that want to have free speech. Is that it? Because we don't really care about innocuous speech, right? I've talked about the illegal speech. The illegal speech are the things that are, inciting violence, going against not a protection order, a suppression order, that kind of thing. So there's illegal speech, which is clearly defined in law already. We are not arguing that shouldn't be there, right? So the existing law, we think, is fine. Then there's innocuous speech, which is basically the kind of everyday conversation we have with people that's not offensive. And the only thing that free speech law protects is controversial or offensive speech. That's the only thing it's there to protect, because otherwise we wouldn't need it. If everyone was just nice to each other all the time and didn't say anything anyone found offensive, then there would be no point in having free speech laws. But what is a law? What are they trying to do? What would a restriction look like? Well, if you break the law, there's a consequence. So what the recommendation here is from the affirmative is that if you say something, just merely the act of saying things is a violation of the law and is going to see you imprisoned or somehow sanctioned. So what's an example of this? It wasn't so long ago that there was a cartoon published and Louisa Wall decided that it was offensive. And I'm not even going to deny that. I think if someone finds it offensive, they find it offensive. And maybe many people found it offensive, right? Maybe 50% of people, I have no idea. That's right. Some percentage of people found that offensive. And so there was a claim made to the Human Rights Tribunal to say that this shouldn't have been published because it was so offensive and, frankly, it was deemed by some to be racist. The court decided that it didn't rise to the point of, calling, basically violating any of the laws of the country or violating the Human Rights Act. After this, Louisa Wall requested or recommended in the paper that there be a change to the law calling for a duty of care on publishers which would mean that there would be a sanction against publishers if they insulted or published something that was offensive to someone. That's what we're talking about, right? That there would be some kind of sanction, some kind of control on the press, so that we no longer have a free press, and that they would have to make sure that they would not offend anyone. Example 2. Not so long ago, there was a listener article which suggested that that science shouldn't include Maori knowledge. I'm not debating that tonight. Some people found that very offensive, and I acknowledge that. Other people found, and they agreed with it, whatever. So there was a point of disagreement. And some people said it was racist. And they were calling, basically there was, it went beyond discussion, and it was, basically making personal attacks. Now, in this case, there wasn't a call for control or for any kind of legislation. But what did happen is the people involved had to step down from various organisations and have various financial consequences to that. Now, there's a bit of an overlap here, because we can see in some situations where society in general is dogpiling onto people and not letting them, or not even hearing them speak. Because what happened in that particular case was a lot of the people who were making the claims about racism and everything, I understand, hadn't even read the article. Right? So in other words, the issue was that people didn't even have the time to actually understand the issues that had been discussed or had been promoted. Moving on. The third example, which is reasonably recent, was definitely the state interfering in free speech. And that was students in the United States being arrested for what they said about Israel. So they were saying that basically condemning the Israeli government for what they see as genocide. Again, I'm not making a comment here or there whether that is a correct position, but they were detained by the ICE, which is the controls immigration, and they were threatened with being deported. In one case, they were just a student organiser, and in the other case, they had just written a single article. And that's it. One was a PhD, and the other one was also a student, I forget. I didn't have the notes here, but both students. And the final example is Harvard University, which has been, not threatened, but actually had their overseas student certification pulled by the federal government, by Donald Trump, because he refused, the Harvard University refused to give information about their students and their protest activities. And the intention there was to find these students which had spoken out against Israel in order to be able to detain them by ICE and then deport them to their country of origin. This is the real issue that we see on the ground. It's not a theoretical issue. And yes, it does involve, in this case, the reason Trump said that this was going to be the case is because they were anti-Semites. Is that a fair interpretation? Are we leaving the determination of who can say what up to the government? And that's what the situation is. They're claiming that, a particular position is one that can be punished under the law, and then go and do it. So this is my concern, that if we allow people to say, well, sticks and stones may break your bones is false, and therefore if you say something and it hurts my feelings that you should be arrested, perhaps imprisoned or deported, we do have a problem. Sticks and stones may break your bones is true. It's basically saying that you have a choice about whether you feel insulted or not. It's a choice. And you can choose not to be. But it doesn't give you the right to determine or insist that someone who speaks to you is going to be punished under the law. I think the case made by the affirmative, talking about people who are becoming extremists, who go into echo chambers, is an interesting one. Because what we see, and especially in Germany, who has outlawed, for example, the Nazis, the ADF party is doing very well, thank you very much. It hasn't stopped hatred at all. Trying to outlaw hate doesn't work. We can't allow it because basically what it does is it forces those views underground where they cannot be examined, where there is no light, and there they fester, and then they come to New Zealand and shoot 50 people. Thank you.
Eve? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. When they start talking about law, I got really, really excited because I'm actually a law student and I really, really love talking about this because what's really interesting about the types of laws that we're talking about in this debate here is that they're actually quite a significant gap in the law that we already have. So for example, in New Zealand, hate speech isn't a crime, but it's still factored into things like sentencing. So our courts already place quite a high, what's it called? They quite care about it a lot because they do think it's important when considering when people are committing crimes. But note that we also have things like torts, which allow us to sue for things like defamation, which allow us to sue people for things like libel, which allow us to say that certain speech aren't okay. So the types of laws that we're talking about here are speech in which it is not already regulated. That means that in the case of defamation, it has to be about a specific person. But in hate speech, it has to be about a specific group. So what's actually happening is that the type of harm is exactly identical. But what is not identical is a person's ability to go through and get redress for the harm that has been caused to them. Because note that if someone publishes an article and outright says your name and then says racist things about you and then attacks your character and publishes it for all to see, someone can sue you for that. You can pursue legal action. But in this debate, the people that we're talking about do not have access to that. Because they are not outright named, but characteristics of their identity are told to the entire world that they are not worthy, that they are not equal to the rest of society, that they are worthy of violence, we do not protect them. Three things that I'm going to talk about. Firstly, what is it that we're talking about? I just kind of covered that actually. Secondly, what is the role of the law? And thirdly, what is the role of the state? So, what we're talking about is gaps in the law in which people do not have redress for harm done to them because they're not outrightly attacked. So what is the role of the law then? Note that they gave you some examples about times when people said maybe we should have hate speech laws because people are able to publish harmful things. We should put duties of care on publishers to ensure that they're not talking badly about certain groups. Note that I think there's three things here. Firstly, is that we already allow for limits to free speech. What we're doing is extending that to people who do not have a viable avenue currently. But secondly, I think that when they're talking about these examples of things like people being arrested for protesting the Israeli government, note that I just think that courts are quite competent. I think that judges are quite good at their jobs. I think that when it is very clear that the amount of speech has not actually harmed anyone, that it is not stopping people from feeling safe, courts can interpret it and say that person is not guilty. That means that when protesters are arrested in certain places for saying things that maybe the government doesn't agree with, the courts are separate enough that it allows them to be able to stop that. Note that that largely mitigates the harm on people saying things and being prosecuted for it, even if it's not directly harmful. Because when the courts can go through and interpret the law and say that it doesn't apply, that means that those people don't end up in prison, they are minorly harmed. But what does happen is that people are put in prison before they do things like commit further hate crimes. It means that if you tweet something that says that you hate a certain race, or that you hate trans people and you think that they deserve to die, know that that is not currently covered under our current law, and it allows police to intervene before you actually go out and commit that violence. That means that we are certain to keep people safe. Because know that if we even keep one person safe from this violence, from this hate speech, from their personal character being attacked, you have to believe us that we should place limits. Because what their main benefit is that people can have healthy debates, that people can challenge the democracies, and people can continue to discuss really important things. But now here's where I'm going to move on to my second question of what is the role of the state. Because Matthew told you just in his first speech that the role of the state is quite important. Because individuals like me and you cannot go and stop this hate speech. Because even if we go and tell people that what they say is not okay, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to stop. It doesn't mean that their views are probably not going to go underground, because society still tells them to stop. But in the cases in which society tells you to stop and you refuse to, the state needs to intervene because they are the only ones with the power and capacity to do so. And note that the lack of limits creates misinformation, which creates laws which the state can do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a moment, sorry.
Start.
Very good. Well, thank you. The Moot suggests that in order to keep people safe, we need limits to free speech, and we've heard from the affirmative on that. My contention and our team's contention is that actually, if you want to talk about safety, to keep people safe, we need free speech. A lot of the issues that are brought up by the affirmative, I think, are pertinent to what we're talking about. And I just want to address some of them, and then I'll go back to what I wanted to say. But first of all, the idea that words are violence. One of the key reasons we have free speech is so that we don't commit violence. That's the purpose of free speech. There's a philosopher, and I forget his name, he says, we think and we speak so that our ideas die, but we don't. Ideas do have consequences, but the way we deal with that is through our speech and coming to positive conclusions. Now, some other issues that I just want to quickly touch on with regard to this is that unregulated speech brings about echo chambers. By definition, the affirmative said that unregulated speech brings echo chambers of ideas. By definition, regulated speech says these are the ideas that are allowed, and everything beyond this is not allowed. I mean, that's an echo chamber if we go by definition. Now, I should comment on what I wanted to say. Speech, as well as for advancing knowledge, as well as for protecting us from conflict and war, is there to keep accountable those who are in power. That's been one of the key reasons that we have freedom of speech. And our first speaker spoke about the issue of power, and those who are in power can speak about issues that those who are vulnerable cannot. And so free speech is the weapon of the oppressed and the tool of the minority to speak up and to fight against dissent. You don't have to look far outside of New Zealand to see that there are many countries where speech is not respected by the authorities. And you don't have to look far into history to see that actually for majority of history, nations around the world and leaders and authorities have looked to suppress those who are dissenting. Why? Because they want to possess power, and fair enough, that's okay. If they want to do that, they're allowed to. But actually, if we want to make sure that people are free, to speak up and fight against these ideas, we need them to have access to free speech. Those, as I say, those in authority look to maintain their power through censorship and silence, simply put. Socrates was put to death for corrupting the minds of the youth and for, as he says, for not recognizing the gods of the state. The question is, who are today's gods of the state? If you go to Iran, they will tell you who the god of the state is. And if you dare to criticize the state, you will be put in prison and you will die, really. And there are cases of that. And so that's part of it. Was Galileo not imprisoned for disobeying the edicts of the Catholic Church? Today, we have so much institutional abuse happening, and has happened for much of history. But the only reason that we are able to hear about these and that we're able to deal with these issues of institutional abuse is because people have the right to speak up, to come out and to hold accountable those who possess power over them. Whether it's abuse in state care, that's, we've been talking about in our country for the last 12, 18 months, whether it's criminal rape gangs in the UK, whether it's abuse within religious institutions. These people were kept silent in fear because they were not able to speak. And those people who were perpetrating the abuses were able to do that. Why? Because speech was not a gift given to these people. So I really think, when the other side speaks about people who have been oppressed or who are vulnerable, who are not able to speak about, they brought up the rainbow community not being able to speak up out of fear. That's a terrible plight on our society, that people are not able to speak up about these issues, about who they are. But the answer to that isn't censorship, because as Peter mentioned, censorship doesn't make these ideas go away. The answer to what these people are suffering from is not regulation, it's actually allowing them to speak up and creating a culture where people are able to speak freely and without fear. And I think that's enough.
Okay?
Yeah.
Start.
This side wants to say that free speech allows you to protect yourself. But at no point do they ever explain as to how these people are able to protect themselves using free speech. That is to say that if your boss makes some racist comments and that makes you feel bad, you are not able to speak up against your racist boss because you are afraid of getting fired, because that person can, stop you from being able to network with other people. That effectively creates an echo chamber. And importantly, it's an echo chamber that causes violence. One at the lowest level that excludes certain people from going towards spaces and not being able to get all the benefits from that spaces. For example, you don't feel comfortable in the workplace and you're not able to progress in that workplace because of it. But the highest level, it creates harmful sentiments. Ones in which people are able to say that, we don't like this certain group of people and that we want to do bad and harmful things to those groups of people. How you stop things like, how you stop things like shooting, how you stop things like extremism is by being able to restrict this free speech. Because even if the alternative was, echo chambers on our side of the house, at the very least, those were safer, non-violent echo chambers. So, the first thing I want to do is outline what exactly the change is in this debate. I think, the obvious change here is that we're just widening our current conceptions of what is offensive or misinformation. No, that's pretty lax right now, right? Because we allow things like misinformation about vaccines, and that directly leads to people doing things like, not taking the vaccine and dying from that, or voting in potentially harmful policy that doesn't allow us to respond to COVID-19 effectively. It allows allows people to question Maori people's place in New Zealand and in specific sectors like science, which make those people feel uncomfortable to going in there because now they feel like they're not going to be represented in that space. And this seems analysis suggests they want pretty lax laws on freedom of speech because their broad defense is that you can always defend yourself with freedom of speech. That as long as you can say whatever you want, you're able to defend themselves. Obviously, they don't have to defend the most extreme examples, but know that the same went for us. And the structural reason for that was because people don't want massive impositions on free speech, because they just broadly like free speech. They like to be able to do things like protest, which is why most people and most places around the world do not support doing things like arresting people protesting against Israel. The only reason why those things happen is because you allow misinformation to be spread. You allow the Trump administration to get voted in by directly constantly promoting this kind of misinformation around things like kings. You allow the AfD in Germany to be able to say too much, and you allow them to get away with tricking populations into voting for them and them enacting harmful policy. What you should believe at the end of this is that we're able to prevent the worst harms that this side wants to talk about. We're able to limit the AfD's messaging. We're able to limit these people that are able to get control of the state and do all the bad things they want to do. Note the entire case is premised on bad intervention of the state. If we prove that the state is not going to do bad information on our side of the house, and in fact we do less of it, we're able to win on that. But even if we had to defend bad intervention from the state, I want to note that, for every instance where they do a bad form of intervention, like shutting down a protest that has a good and meaningful cause, they also shut down things like vaccine protests. They also shut down xenophobic protests and whatnot. Why do we still win in this instance? Firstly, is that some people need state intervention. That is to say that, if you are protesting against racism, it's very unclear what that group is going to do about it. Because, think about the disadvantage a lot of these groups have. If you're from a certain ethnic background, you probably don't have as much social and financial capital as those from majorities due to things like historical oppression. What that means then is that on our side, what that means is you're not able to actually do anything with that form of free speech. Meanwhile, on our side of the house, when you're able to do things like arrest those racist protesters, deter them with things like the threat of suing, that is something that is actually able to stop them. You are actually able to stop these most harmful instances. So that means we're able to stop, these bad forms of people's rights being violated. But the second thing is that the state just uniquely has a form of obligation here, because the state has just because of all the things that Matt told you around how the state has an obligation in this instance. So I think at the end of this, what you should believe is on our side of the house, we're able to stop the worst instances of hate speech from occurring. We're able to stop the worst instances of people's rights being violated, and that only happens when you're uniquely able to stop people from doing the worst kinds of things. It's best to stop a person from being in a bad situation. That's uniquely something I'm unable to do on our side.
Good evening. I'm most impressed. These guys can speak faster than I can even think. I have to have missed half those points. This one will be a much more plodding presentation. Guys, let me make a point here that free speech is not a deeply historic right. It's a very fragile right. And it is a right that we have had to fight for. I'll take you back a short distance. 1948, 3 years after the war, the United Nations got together and put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, free speech is only mentioned in the preamble once and never again. But Article 19, I'll read to you. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of the frontiers. Clearly they hadn't anticipated the internet. And if you think about that specification, it's very light on limitations. In fact, there are none. So, and it's been written for an international audience, so that the countries could take it, bend, fold, spindle, and mutilate it, but at least it has a place in history. And keep in mind that with the exception of 2 Muslim countries, all the countries of the world at the time signed that declaration. For record, most of the Muslim countries have withdrawn and joined the Islamic Declaration on Human Rights, which cut women's rights by half. But long before, let's just look at the history. At the end of the Dark Ages, in the feudal times, the world was dominated by 2 institutions, monarchies and religion. And life was pretty damn grim. Only the people with power had any real say. There was not a press. There was nothing resembling free speech. You got out of joint with somebody else, it was settled with personal violence or by violence at an institutional level or by violence at the state level, or you might just get nailed by the Inquisition. It's been a long road. And let me tell you that starting with Descartes in about 1625, the Enlightenment kicked off. He, by the way, is the father of rationalism, rationalist house. He's followed in order by a lot of the philosopher scholars, like Locke, a little bit later in England, Voltaire. Now, Voltaire is very important because he's the guy who coined the concept of free speech. He joined together the idea that the individual had rights and the idea that people wanted to speak. And that was the origin of it. And it took from there to now just 300 years for us to get to a modest definition of free speech at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Since then, it's been honoured and breached. But the important point is it is one of the crowning glories of Western civilization. I use the point quite explicitly because it's Western civilization that took the concept, and many others, to develop the scientific method and do all the modifications to societies that took the world out of the feudal ages. And its present model in the West is now being undermined. Those freedoms of speech want to be cornered, corralled, reduced. And the more you do it, the more you play into the hands of the powerful, who will take every restriction and tighten it and squeeze it out of existence. This is the tool of autocrats. Now, I hear from the proponents that they want to defend the victims of a different problem, which is excessive speech. The whole phenomenon that we're faced with right now, the whole phenomenon is a function of the emergence of the internet and its negative effects. You can tinker at the edges. I want to say one last item. New Zealand has adequate laws for dealing with this. Throughout the laws, excellent laws, and we must rely on those. The upcoming Law Commission report is going to be sharpening the detail. Otherwise, I say we rely on the caliber of our legislation in this country to look after us.
Now, Eve will sum up and close the proponents of the Moot case. 10 minutes, Eve. 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Start.
At the end of their first speech, they told you about something that happened that was really harmful in New Zealand, which was the Christchurch mosque shooting, which was incredibly devastating for a lot of people's lives, for a lot of people's families, for a lot of people's ability to feel safe. That was a terrible, terrible thing to have happened. And in our country, where we feel so safe, where we don't feel that there are those kinds of things that are festering under the surface that allow such acts of violence. But unfortunately, there were words circulating at that time. There were words that allowed that violence to happen. There were words afterwards by people on the internet saying that it was justified. Such a horrible, terrible act that was allowed to not only stand on its own, but to be propagated by an environment that allowed violence because of these unlimited expressions, unlimited free speech. It allowed people to be attacked afterwards. It allowed people to continue to incite violence afterwards because they believed it was justified, because it was only seen as a problem of one individual, but it was not. It was a problem that had been happening for years. The Muslim community in New Zealand had been asking for years for the New Zealand government to do something about this before this happened, and they did not listen. The New Zealand government did not listen because they were worried about infringing on people's freedom of expression. But note that we do allow for limits on freedom of expression where we believe it hurts people. We do allow for freedom of expression, as Matthew told you at first, when he told you that we don't allow people to threaten to bomb schools because we think that's harmful. But note that the only difference that is happening here is whether or not we allow limits on free speech of the majority to attack minority groups. Because that is what hate speech laws are. I told you that there is a gap in our law that is not currently filled. But I tell you that this mosque shooting wasn't the only example where this has happened. There are genocides all over the world where this has happened. Where in the examples of Germany and Hitler, it was already based on people's views. One person took that and then things happened afterwards. Note that we also told you the role of misinformation in this debate. Where we get to stop that misinformation, we get to stop harmful things happening. That is what we told you at first. That is what we continue to tell you. But note that what they told you is that words aren't violence. But they are. Because when I tell you terrible things about yourself, that doesn't hurt any less than being physically beaten up. It doesn't hurt any less when people tell you that you are worthless as a human, that you are not worthy of love, that you are not worthy of a place in our society. That is harmful. That is incredibly painful. But what then they didn't tell you is that, if you are oppressed in society, free speech is your tool to be able to go and stop this. But obviously that just isn't true. Because when you have a majority of people who allow this kind of rhetoric to continue, who allow people to make bad comments, obviously that doesn't shut down the bad ideas. When the group that is being attacked is a minority in society, they're not able to address every single person who hates them as a part of their identity. You cannot expect a gay person in a country to have to go and pick a fight with every single homophobe to be able to shut down those ideas. Because unfortunately, society isn't a little debate like this. It is a bunch of individuals with a bunch of views who can just go over and do whatever they want. 2 questions I'll ask you. And these are just largely what each side argued. Firstly, to what extent is limits on free speech justifiable? They tell you that free speech is really important. That's really important for a healthy democracy. They tell you that words aren't violence. But mostly they tell you that they're worried about us taking it too far, that states will take it too far. But what are we actually talking about in this debate? We are talking about the speech that are currently not covered under law, that are things like hate speech. Note that in places like bad authoritarian governments, places where you are shutting down protests, it doesn't matter what the law is because the state will just take it into their hands anyway. Note that this is where it's really important, where I told you about the role of courts. Because when you do have liberal democracies that do have separate courts, that have courts that are able to interpret the law and say that it doesn't apply in certain situations, it's very easy for liberal governments to just pass legislation that says things like banning hate speech on certain groups where it threatens the physical violence of those groups. Things like that are very simple to ban. It means that the courts can interpret whether or not that has happened in this instance. That means that things like protests, which are still allowed in our current laws, are still going to be allowed under these other laws, because these courts are always determining a balance of rights. Personally, I think the judges are quite good at their jobs. They are actually quite competent and they are actually able to make these principal calls quite well. But note that they cannot make these principal calls if they do not have the law in front of them that asks them, is it a justified limit on free speech? Because if we don't have these hate laws in front of them, they cannot make that call because they just have to always buy into the fact that because we do not have freedom from discrimination to the same extent that we have freedom of expression, that means that freedom of expression will always have to win, even when it is harmful. What did Archibald tell you? Firstly, Matthew told you about the role of the state, about how the state has a unique capacity to be able to solve these problems. Secondly, we told you about how we protect people by allowing free speech to continue to foster. You create places that allow violence, when you create places where people are allowed to express their views. Because as I told you, it isn't just like a big, huge debate that people are having, it's lots of small debates. And when you have those small debates, you have places where people are able to win. There is now a space where that speech is allowed to foster. It is not shut down. They are worried about it being pushed underground that then allows these views to foster more. But I just simply don't see how that isn't stopped on their side. How is it that these people don't just continue to hold those views? Because when you allow them to just continue, even if society shuts them down in this marketplace of ideas, even if like people have unlimited free speech and the oppressed are able to speak out against it, in their best case, these people are still pushed underground. They still have their views being told that society doesn't allow it. But then these exact same things still happen. These people still can go and commit violence against other groups. They can still go and speak out and say terrible things about people that are harmful in and of themselves. That means that on their side, they still have all of these harms of these views being pushed underground. On their side, they still have all of these harms of people being shut down, of protests being shut down because states can just do whatever they want, because they can just create law. But know that on our side, we uniquely are able to help the people who need it most, the people who cannot speak out on this marketplace of ideas, because they are threatened, because they are killed, because they are told that they are a minority group and deserve all of the things that are happening to them. So note that I've told you just now that the extent to which free limits on free speech are justifiable is the extent to which they are directly contradicting with other people's rights, their right to their safety, their right to be free from discrimination. That is where hate speech laws come in, to provide definitive laws that allow this kind of speech to be shut down before it is given too large of a platform, before it leads to physical violence. I think we would all agree that we would much rather people be shut down before they commit an act of violence, before they go out and harass someone on the street, before they go out and kill someone, rather than afterwards. Because note in New Zealand, hate speech, these hate laws, don't exist. The only time that a person's views are accounted for is after sentencing. That means that if someone goes out and commits a hate crime and kills someone, the only time that motive is considered, the only time any comments that they've made about that race, about them being trans, only applies after sentencing. At most, it gives them maybe a couple of extra years in prison. That does not bring that person's life back. It does not decrease the amount of fear that people have for their safety. It does not increase any sense of debate. It does not increase any sense of people feeling like their ideas are heard when you actively are in danger, because these people will never be able to speak out about themselves. And that was my second question. To what extent is free speech harmful? Because they say that it's not violence. But firstly,
30
it is.
seconds.
And secondly, even when it's not, it allows these environments to foster. It allows people to say things that are actively harmful, that signal to other people that they support acts of violence, that they support them saying terrible things, that they support them not infringing on people's rights to live, on their dignity, on their self-preservation. That is incredibly harmful, and is much more harmful than the state potentially intervening any time. Thank you.
Peter will now close for the opponents.
Thank you for coming tonight and listening to all the speakers. Obviously, been a very energetic and sometimes passionate speech. I think my impression, however, is that the affirmative has depended quite heavily on the message that we're talking about incitement to violence. Incitement to violence is already quite illegal. Right? You cannot incite violence against a group even. So incitement into violence it doesn't need to be a particular person. But if you were going out, say, and advocating that you go out and attack or kill people, then you can be most assured that that would be dealt with by the police. So I kind of reject the fact that we have people going around inciting violence in New Zealand, mainly evidenced by the fact that you don't actually see mass murders in New Zealand. The case of the shooter was one where he had been deliberately seeking out particular venues where that kind of speech wasn't challenged. 4chan and 8chan were the examples, and also physically going and meeting people. So and this is not atypical of those kinds of extremists. You don't grow extremists if they're talking with and communicating with people who don't agree with their position. And how do I know that? Well, I mean, I've had a reasonably long track record of talking to people, Christians, working with people, and it's through talking with people that you generate understanding and unity, so that you may not agree, but you come to understand and maybe even have compassion for people. So the idea that we put people in bubbles or even imprison them or restrict them from being able to say what they say doesn't really work. They may not agree. I mean, I'm sure lots of pet Trumpers in the United States, the problem with them is that they are going into these bubbles. You have truth. There's a whole network that's been established just to be able to create that nice little bubble of safety. So like pushing people into the dark is not the way to be able to address that. And what has been effective is people going to, even the KKK, for example, there's situations where people, there was one gentleman went in and had a respectful discussion in their own groups and convinced them out of their extremist positions. And that was free speech. In fact, many of the communities that we've been talking about, homosexual, trans, women, they've all benefited from free speech. So, what would happen if, women didn't have free speech rights in New Zealand, when they went out and they wanted to get the right to vote? They went out and they protested. Now, that wasn't necessarily well accepted. They were arrested, I believe. But the core right to be able to say what you want was core, because that wasn't tolerated in many countries, well, pretty much any country before that. And we now have gay rights legislation, gay marriage. Well, it wasn't too long ago that homosexuality was actually illegal in New Zealand. Well, how did that change? Well, it's through free speech. I can't even speak myself. Through speech. So the thing is that by having free speech, you're able to actually have a voice. You're actually able to change people's minds and change the law. I've done it twice myself. We've gone into select committee, and I've had to sit through a Catholic priest talking about something completely diametrically opposed to my position. And the thing with that select committee is everyone there has the right to speak and say what they want, even though you might say that Catholic priest had a hateful position, one that I was deeply insulted by, something that was saying that basically the Catholic Church had a right to torture people. It almost made me sick to my stomach. But I had to sit there through that speech because he had the right to speak, and I didn't make any kind of move to protest then. He had the right to say what he had to say. I had the right to say what I had to say. And it's through having those kinds of communications that we actually build understanding and actual empathy with each other, not through putting people in prison or shutting down their speech. In fact, shutting down people's speech is the fastest way to alienate them and to make them violent. If you want a violent person, shut down their speech and see how fast it takes. Thank you.
Okay. Now we'll take questions from the floor. Maximum of 5 questions, please. Please, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, can I have a final show of hands after hearing arguments for and against? Those for the moot point, can you raise your hands? 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. Okay. Those against? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Absentees? Okay. So, final score for the moot point is 7 against 6.
Thank you, everyone.
So, we have increased,
Yes.
but we're still short.
You have increased double from 3 to 6.
Yes.
They've reduced from 8 to 7.
Right. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today.
We still got some others. One of those. Yeah, we changed one more. That's
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Very well.
Thank you.
Can I eat some?